Both sides will pay.
White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow admitted Sunday what nearly every economist knows to be true. The tariffs President Trump is imposing on Chinese goods imported into the U.S. are not solely paid for by the Chinese.
But it's U.S. businesses and U.S. consumers who pay, correct?
Yes, to some extent. Again, both sides will suffer on this.
On Friday, President Trump slapped a 25% tariff on approximately $200 billion worth of Chinese imports and is now ordering his trade representatives to start the paperwork to tariff an additional $300 billion. Basically everything China sends to the U.S., from cell phones to furniture. It's a fight the president says is worth having.
So our country can take in $120 billion a year in tariffs, paid for mostly by China, by the way, not by us.
Tariffs do make Chinese goods more expensive, which can hurt China's economy. But the actual tariffs are a tax paid by U.S. companies that import Chinese products. Companies can either take on those costs and make less money, or they raise prices on U.S. consumers, which is what often happens. But President Trump isn't just battling China on the world stage. He's also at war with Congress. Democrats have launched more than 20 separate investigations into President Trump, his actions as president, his personal finances, and his administration's policies.
The Democrats are more interested in subpoenas than solutions.
On Face the Nation, Republican House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy criticized Democrats for what isn't getting done.
We want to move forward. We got health care. We got trade. We got a crisis on our border.
And while Democrats say they can multitask,
Don't think that we can't do both.
even on a bipartisan issue like infrastructure, so far there's been no concrete legislative progress.
So Ben Tracy joins us now from the White House. So Ben, China promised retaliation, and now we know what that retaliation looks like. $60 billion worth of U.S. goods going to be seeing increased tariffs?
You know, I think this is actually a fairly measured response from China when you look at the numbers. They basically did what the U.S. did. They raised the tariff amount on the dollar amount that it was already being tariffed. So China had tariffs on $60 billion worth of U.S. goods. That goes back to the first round of this tariff fight last year. Instead of raising the dollar amount, they simply raised the tariff amount. In their minds, this might be a way of saving face without overly escalating this trade war with President Trump.
So we heard a little bit from White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow at the start of your piece there, who's on Fox News yesterday. And he repeatedly mentioned that the president could possibly be meeting with China's President Xi Jinping at the G20 summit, maybe sort of a sideline conversation, and that could maybe be a way out. The president has bragged, if you will, and put a lot of weight on the nature of his personal connections with world leaders, and he seems to get along with Xi. What's the White House saying about this strategy?
Well, it is interesting. I mean, President Trump, even during the last couple of days, has gone out of his way to say that he is still friends with President Xi, but he always makes the distinction that President Xi is looking out what is best for China, and President Trump says he is looking out for what is best for the U.S. But yes, both of these leaders will be at the G20 summit at the end of June in Osaka, Japan, and they likely will meet in some fashion. It's hard to imagine the two of them being able to sit down and hammer out a trade deal, though, if nothing else happens in the interim. I think what we're going to have to see now is further negotiations between both the U.S. side and the Chinese side. The Chinese have said that they have invited President Trump's trade negotiators to come back to Beijing for yet another round of talks. This will be the 12th round of trade talks to try to hammer something out. But if they're not close to a deal by the time the G20 summit happens, I can't imagine that President Trump and President Xi will sit down in a room and have that fall apart.
You know, Ben, when these trade tensions began, among the first people sort of hit the hardest were farmers, especially soybean farmers. You know, a lot of people in the area of the country that supported President Trump. Is there a concern coming from the White House that as this trade war sort of ratchets up, that the people who supported President Trump will be hit the hardest, and the timing could have been worse as we sort of head towards the 2020 race?
Yeah, and I think you're seeing that in some of the tweets that President Trump is sending out, where he is going out of his way to say to people that these tariffs don't really impact American consumers or American businesses. That obviously is not true. Tariffs are a tax that are paid by U.S. businesses, by U.S. importers, and then those costs are often passed on to U.S. consumers in the form of higher prices. And you're right about farmers. They really have been hit the hardest so far in this trade battle. They were hit very hard the first time around, and these increased tariffs that we're now seeing from China are likely to be on agricultural products, because that is the main thing that we export to China. The real difference here is, when you look at these numbers and you see that we now have tariffs on $250 billion worth of Chinese goods, and they only have tariffs on $60 billion. The reason for that disparity is because we simply don't sell as much stuff to China as they sell to us, so they don't have that dollar amount that they can tariff.
Yeah, that completely makes sense. Meantime, on the domestic front, the president is busy battling his own Congress. What's coming up this week in terms of the Prez versus Capitol Hill?
Well, it's going to be a busy week. You have congressional Democrats on the Hill who are really now going after the White House because they believe the White House is not cooperating with many of the investigations that are ongoing on the Hill. By one count, there are about 20 separate investigations. Congressional Democrats have now subpoenaed President Trump's tax returns after being rebuffed by the Secretary of the Treasury last week. So they're hoping to get those by the end of the week. There's an end of the week deadline to receive those. You have the Senate Intelligence Committee, led by Republicans, that has subpoenaed Donald Trump Jr. to come back in and give more testimony. So that is happening. And in the background, you still have congressional Democrats saying that they want Robert Mueller to come to the Hill and testify about the Russia investigation. There is no date set for that yet, but that is something that the Democrats clearly still want.
Indeed. Ben, thank you so much.
Thanks.